All right, testing one, two, three. Hi there, everybody on, let's see, YouTube and um, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts. Our worship leader, Matt, has been so very diligent to get these studies out on all those different platforms, and I am very, very grateful. Um, why am I here? Beautiful downtown San Bernardino in what's called the Breezeway. At the other end of this alleyway is Viva La Boba. Got a boba shop over there. Behind you guys, behind that screen, the screen on that side, is City Hall in beautiful downtown San Bernardino. It's New Year's Day, so it's quiet down here right now. Um, this is my third location. I've been to two other locations before this, and there were too many people out making noise, for recording. It was hard. But what am I doing here? These are what I'm calling as a series of studies that I'm going to do here. I'm calling the Lost Leviticus tapes. The Lost Leviticus tapes. 3 years ago now, in 2022, we were in the middle of Leviticus, or at least nearing the end of Leviticus. And we had some recordings of these studies that were lost. And I am going to take the blame for that, and I will explain to you why. When I looked back at the recordings before this and the ones after, this is funny, something that probably only Matt and I would know or understand, but the recording was from a different angle, different side, and so that's usually something I would do. I usually would purposely mix it up just to make Matt angry if I could. And he always recorded from a certain side, and then when I do it, I would record from a different side. And so when I looked at those, they were from that opposite side, and I thought, oh man, I was the one that recorded. And I either lost them and never gave them to him, or they got lost in transitioning from me to him. I do not remember. But these are missing from the YouTube channel. But because of that, they were also missing, or they were going to be missing from the podcast, because Matt has been adding the Leviticus series on the podcast. And so he had asked me if I would be willing to re-record them. I certainly was willing to do that, since I was, again, the one that lost them. So that's what we got, the Lost Leviticus tapes here. And tapes, I mean, who even calls them tapes anymore? That just means that I'm old. The Lost Leviticus tapes. And so that's what we got going on here. And so we've got probably 3 or 4 studies that I'm going to be re-recording in this manner. I don't know if the same location, but we'll see how that goes. So I'll be re-recording these. And I know that as I was going back through and looking at things, and I think there'll be 3, possibly 4 studies that I'll do that will kind of close the gap on this series of Leviticus. So for this first one, this first of the Lost Leviticus tapes, we are going to be in Leviticus 21 and 22. And again, this is going to continue from the Leviticus series that's on YouTube, which gets to chapter 20 and then stops, and then jumps around. I think chapter 25, it jumps to 25 or something, I don't remember. But anyways, that's what we got going on. All right, so we're going to be in Leviticus chapter 21 and 22 today, and we will be looking at the priesthood, really. These 2 chapters comprise a portion of the priesthood. This is not everything about the priesthood. This really deals with some specific subjects. And this is a little bit difficult. Some of these sections are a little bit difficult to order for me, because it almost seems like there's just various rules that are included. And so I wasn't really sure exactly how to title each of those. So I figured, why fight it and try to title them, try to force a title. Where I could find a title, I did. And where I couldn't find a specific title, I just left it alone, and we'll just read through it. Leviticus 21 is where we will start. And for those of you that like to take notes, We've got Leviticus chapter 21 is broken up this way. We've got the priests. There was addressing the priests in verses 1 through 9. Okay, verses 1 through 9 addressing the priests. Beginning at verse 10 and down to verse 15, it's the high priests. Still priests, but the high priests specifically. And then beginning at verse 16 down to verse 24 of Leviticus 21 is descendants with defects, but still descendants of Aaron, descendants of the priests. But these are individuals, males, we'll find out, with defects. And so I do have some subtitles in here. And so let's begin at verse 1. Verses 1 to 6, again, dealing with the priests, has to do specifically with their mourning, the way that they mourn over the dead. And so it says in verse 1, and the Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron. The sons of Aaron, the Aaronic, the tribe of Aaron, the family of Aaron, they were always going to be the priests. And so these are the sons of Aaron that would be the priests. And say to them, none shall defile himself for the dead among his people. None shall defile himself for the dead among his people. Now, it is going to seem like, as we go through these verses, it is going to seem like, and I'm telling you this because this is how it first came across to me. It seemed like God was telling the priests not to mourn, as if he was calling for a stiff upper lip, as the British would say, or stoicism. You can't mourn, you can't feel bad, you can't show emotion. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The key is in verse 1, where he says, none shall defile himself for the dead among his people. So this has to do with keeping the priesthood or the priests pure, keeping them from being defiled, keeping them from infecting themselves with sin, essentially, because they're the priests. They're part of the priesthood. They have got to be the example. And that doesn't mean that they cannot mourn, that they cannot cry or be upset. They need to be careful that they're not doing things that are going to break the law and thus ceremonially defile themselves. So none shall defile himself for the dead among his people, except for, so look what God does. He makes some exceptions. Except for his relatives who are nearest to him, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, and his brother. Also, his virgin sister who is near to him. Maybe that means that she lived with him. Who has had no husband, speaking about that virgin sister, for her he may defile himself. Otherwise, in verse 4, he shall not defile himself, being a chief man among his people to profane himself. There it is right there. He's a chief man among the people, so he's got to be the example of how to mourn. We'll talk some more about that in just a moment. They shall not, verse 5, they shall not make any bald place on their heads. Okay, so here's what he's doing. He's telling them what they cannot do in their mourning. Tells them, don't defile yourselves by touching the dead, by approaching the dead. But then he says, you can defile yourself as a priest for your close relatives. Now, it's not that he's saying it's okay to defile yourself. What he's saying is you can attend to your family members that have died. If they're not your family members, then you ought not be touching the dead bodies. But there's other things that they were not allowed to do. Nobody was allowed to do these things. And that begins in verse 5. They shall not make any bald place on their heads, nor shall they shave the edges of their beards, nor make any cuttings in their flesh. What is that all about? Well, you need to know this, that they had come from Egypt, which was pagan, idolatrous. they were living in a land that was surrounded by people groups that were pagan and idolatrous. And those pagan religions included lots of sinful practices, lots of absurdities, really, lots of defilements. One of those areas was in death. And what people would do is they would do these things. They would shave their heads in weird places, shave the edges of their beards, make cuttings in their flesh. These were ways of expressing their frustration and sadness with the loss of their loved one. But they were also, even more than that, they were ways that they would, these were ways of humiliating themselves. To cut a bald spot on your head, that's humiliating, right? I mean, even guys who are losing their hair, don't they, just losing their hair naturally, which, for us is like, well, that's not a big deal, whatever. But even guys who are going bald naturally, they don't want to go bald. For them, for a lot of them, it's humiliating. Not everybody. Some are okay with it, but to do that purposely was to humiliate yourself, to make yourself look funny, cutting the sides of your beard, cutting your flesh. These were all ways of humiliating or humbling yourself, really, before your particular God. Not God, the God of the Bible, but your idol, your particular God. And they did that, again, to show their frustration and their sadness, even anger, but also as part of their prayers or their sacrifice to their particular God, so that, or they did that with the hopes of getting their loved one out of, say, like a purgatory, some place in between life and death, getting them out of there. If they could appease that God would allow their loved one into heaven or into the heavenly places or wherever they believed their loved ones might want to go, might be going. So that's why God is telling the priests, and really everybody was part of this, but especially the priests, you're the chief. What did he call them? The chief man. You're the leaders, so you cannot be acting that way. But for every believer, we're priests of our households, right? Or we have to be careful how we're responding to death, but not just to death, to frustrating situations, sad situations. We've got to make sure that we're not operating in the flesh and without even realizing appealing to some make-believe God, that we're going to harm ourselves or make ourselves humiliate ourselves in order to try to appease our God, to try to get our God to answer, or even if we're doing these things toward our God as Christians. That's not how our God operates. He doesn't operate off of our cutting ourselves or making ourselves look stupid. That's not how he responds. He responds to our prayers, to our cries for mercy, our cries for help. But in the end, I mean, if somebody dies, somebody dies. That's, the Bible says that it is appointed unto man once to die, and then comes the judgment. So when someone dies, we as Christians, we don't try to spring them out of the in-between life. There is no in-between life. Again, the Bible says it is appointed unto man once to die, and then comes the judgment. So we die, and then it's time to stand before God. And do we go to heaven? Do we go to hell? So that's we're not trying to appease our God, so we don't respond this way. He goes on in verse 6, they shall be holy to their God, and not profane the name of their God. So don't humiliate the name of your God. For they offer the offerings of the Lord made by fire. These are the priests. They've got to act appropriately, live appropriately. So they offer the offerings of the Lord made by fire and the bread of their God. Therefore they shall be holy. In Numbers chapter 19, Numbers 19:14. This is the law when a man dies in a tent. All who come into the tent and all who are in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. I share that with you just to give you an idea that when somebody dies inside of a tent back then, um, just to go into the tent in that area made you ceremonially unclean. And there was a way to cleanse yourself. It wasn't as if God rejected you, but there were certain things you could and could not do in that state. But being in that vicinity made you spiritually or ceremonially unclean. I love this in 1 Thessalonians 4:13. But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, those who have died, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. So Paul told us there in the New Testament that we are not to sorrow as those who have no hope. That doesn't mean we can't sorrow. It means that when we sorrow, it's not in a way that expresses our unbelief that in God, or that we have no hope. We can mourn, we can weep for someone who's died because we're going to miss them. But if they're a believer, we know that we're going to see them again, and so we can mourn and miss them, but we need to remember that we're going to see them again. If they're not a believer and they die, and we're not sure were they saved, were they not saved, then yeah, there's a really good chance that we're not going to see them again. But Paul there in Thessalonians was talking to believers, saying, "Hey, if you're mourning for another Christian, you need to remember that you can see them again. So mourn appropriately." Now we move from mourning to marriage. This is for the priests still. God says they shall not take a wife who is a harlot or a defiled woman, nor shall they take a woman divorced from her husband. For the priest is holy to his God. So there's a reason why the priest is holy. And so a life of holiness would dictate that the priest is not marrying a harlot, that's a prostitute, or a defiled woman, just a woman who is morally unclean. She's been sexually active with people. A priest is not to marry that type of woman, nor shall they take a woman divorced from her husband. So he was to be upright in his mourning and in his marriage. He doesn't stop there in marriage. Verse 8 says, "Therefore you shall consecrate him, for he offers the bread of your God." Consecrate means you're going to set them apart as different. It's holy. And that's what each of us should be. Yeah, we're not all officially, Jewish priests, obviously, but we all ought to be living to the best of our ability, living above reproach, doing our best to be different. And as believers, as Christians, certainly with me, we all have a background. And for many of us, our background is shady, as they say in San Bernardino. Shady shade. It's spotted. It's littered with immorality. The good news is that when we surrendered our life to Jesus, He erased that past. Now, there are people that know us that will always remember those things about us. But as far as God is concerned, our sin is as far as the east is from the west. And that's just wonderful, wonderful news, because it means that you and I as Christians, we can actually fulfill these things. And where again we might be with somebody who's in their past would be considered defiled or divorced, sinful. But since coming to Christ, we're a new creation, and we We've been made brand new. But from this point, from being saved, you and I need to strive to live godly lives, holy lives, and not running around um, being in close relationships, romantic relationships with these types of individuals. We need to be like the priests and conduct ourselves accordingly. We're representing God. We're holy. We're consecrated. So let's keep that in mind. He doesn't stop there with the marriage. He goes on to say in verse 8, therefore you shall consecrate him, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy. So if God is holy, I need to be holy. And certainly these priests needed to be holy. And then in verse 9, in marriage, the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by playing the harlot, if the daughter of a priest is sexually active before being married or outside of her marriage, she profanes her father. She shall be burned with fire. Pretty incredible. That's some pretty serious stuff there. It was absolutely necessary that the priest, to the best of his ability, lead his family in a godly manner. That his family worshiped and served the Lord. Obviously, everybody can make their own decisions. And so as a young lady maybe was getting older, she decided she did not want to be obedient to the Lord or to her parents and her father. And she decided that she was going to be sexually active. She would then, by doing so, she was profaning her dad, and then it required that she be burned with fire. It's radical. That's absolutely radical. And I'm sure people would complain about that and go, oh, the Bible, there it is, human sacrifice. No, misunderstood. The young lady would know this. So if she, in fact, chose to be sexually active and thus profane her father, then she was, in fact, choosing to be put to death, choosing to be burned with fire. So they weren't just going out looking for young ladies to burn, young people to burn. This was something that all of Israel would have known. Everybody knew this. And every young lady would have known this. And she would have known what would befall her if she decided to live a sinful lifestyle, a sexually sinful lifestyle specifically. Okay? Now, we move on to the second main division, which is from verses 10 to 15. This has to do with the high priest, and this would be the individual that was in charge of all the priests. Obviously, to begin with, that would have been Aaron, who was the high priest. But it deals with the same two subjects, mourning and marriage. And you'll see some differences in here. Verse 10, he who is the high priest among his brethren, on whose head the anointing oil was poured, and who is consecrated to wear the garments, shall not cover his head nor tear his clothes. Now, it seems like when you first read through that, you're just like, what is he talking about? Well, it gets clear here in verse 11. Nor shall he go near any dead body, nor defile himself for his father or his mother. So the high priest, his guidelines for mourning were even more stringent. He was not allowed to defile himself for his father or his mother. So he would not be allowed to handle the dead body. But he would not be allowed to uncover his head, tear his clothes. Again, these are things that the pagans would do to humiliate themselves. And then in verse 12, it goes on to say, nor shall he go out of the sanctuary, nor profane the sanctuary for his God. For the consecration of the anointing oil of his God is upon him. I am the Lord. So, if that high priest was in the sanctuary in the service of God, he was not to take off any time that he wanted. And even if somebody died, he couldn't just go split and go see them. Again, These are stringent rules, but this is a life that is lived an example to everyone around them. It's representative of God, and so they had to represent God in the correct way and express their mourning in the appropriate way and ways. And so this was even more stringent for the high priest. Verses 13 through 15 have to do with marriage. Let's see if it's different. And he shall take a wife in her virginity. That's the same thing that was said about the priest, just in a different way. You can go back and read that. A widow or a divorced woman, or a defiled woman or harlot, these he shall not marry. There it is, same thing. But he shall take a virgin of his own people as wife. Verse 15, nor shall he profane his posterity among his people, for I, the Lord, sanctify him. So he was to be careful of the example that he was setting for the younger people, his posterity, for his children. He could not profane them. And when we talked about the priest, remember the young ladies were not to profane their fathers. Here, and no doubt for the high priest also, but here it goes both ways. The high priest was not to profane his family, his kids, his offspring. Now, we move on to the third and final main division, which is the descendants with defects. Now, you need to know, well, let's start reading here, and we'll see it in verse 17. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron. Okay? At first it was speak to the priest, speak to the high priest. Now it's speak to Aaron. Speak to Aaron, saying, no man of your descendants. So keep in mind, context. He's talking to Aaron specifically. He says, none of your descendants. He's talking to Aaron's family. Now keep in mind, if you don't know this, or if we haven't talked about it yet in our study in Exodus or Leviticus, Aaron was chosen as the priest, and his sons as priests. And then his family was chosen as priests. Now, not the ladies, but all of the males. But what if there was an issue with some of the males? Was it just automatic that all of the males were priests? Well, generally speaking, yes, but as we're going to see here, if they had defects, they were not allowed to serve in the priesthood. Did that mean that God didn't love them? No, that's not what that meant. We'll see here what's being said. Let's look at verse 17. No man of your descendants in succeeding generations, so kids, grandkids, kids of grandkids, who has any defect, may approach to offer the bread of his God. May not approach, or if they have a defect, they cannot approach. That means they were not allowed to be part of the priesthood. Okay? To offer the bread. That's just a general way of saying the priesthood. So if they had a defect, they were not allowed to serve in the priesthood. Now, what does that mean, defect? Verse 18, for any man who has a defect shall not approach, cannot approach the sanctuary or the altar. A man, he gives us some guidelines here. A man blind or lame, who has a marred face, or any limb too long. Okay, so birth defects, but this wouldn't really necessarily limit it to birth defects. Somebody could go blind later on. They could become lame later on. They could have their face marred later on. Any limb too long, I suppose there could be some accident where a limb was pulled out of socket or stretched, and maybe that's what it's talking about specifically. Verse 20 goes on to say, verse 19, a man who has a broken foot or broken hand, so broken, there it is, broken limbs. They could, those could be broken later on in life. Verse 20, or as a hunchback or a dwarf. Those are sometimes things that we think of as being fairy tales, but it's absolutely true. Somebody could be a hunchback or a dwarf, somebody that was short. Or a man, not just somebody that was short, but somebody that was obviously had a birth defect that caused them to be shorter than than a normal average human being. Somebody could be short, just a short. I'm short. People are short, but that's not what we're talking about. Somebody that would have some sort of defect, a birth defect. Um, Verse 20: a hunchback or a dwarf, a man who has a defect in his eye, or eczema or scab. Eczema would be a skin disease, skin irritation, or scab. That's not just one scab, they scratch themselves. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about somebody who has skin disease. Or is a eunuch. A eunuch was a eunuch, without giving too much detail, was a eunuch could only be a male. And a eunuch would be somebody that was either born without or later on had their uh, their private parts removed, or they were born without them or deformed. Okay, again, it's only a male. That could only happen to a male. So that tells you, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, it could only happen to a male. So that gives you, some clue. So any of these birth defects would keep them from serving in the priesthood. It goes on to say, verse 21, no man of his descendants, of the descendants of Aaron the priest, who has a defect, shall come near to offer the offerings made by fire to the Lord. He has a defect. He shall not come near to offer the bread of his God, meaning he cannot come and be a priest. However, verses 23 through 24, the food. He may eat the bread of his God, both the most holy and the holy. So the priests were allowed to take food, and these family members were allowed to eat that food. The priest could take it and share it with their loved ones, and so they were able to partake of it. Only he shall not go near the veil or approach the altar, because he has a defect, lest he profane my sanctuaries, for I, the Lord, sanctify them. And Moses told it to Aaron and his sons and to all the children of Israel. Now, um, you know, I'm actually, you know what I'm going to do? Well, let's go ahead. Let's do Leviticus 22. We're here, right? Leviticus 22. Then the Lord spoke to Moses. Oh, we got a loud car going by. Street racers in the Dino, man. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons, that they separate themselves from the holy things of the children of Israel, and that they do not profane my holy name by what they dedicate to me. I am the Lord. So we're talking about the holy things here. Say to them, whoever of all your descendants throughout your generations, who goes near the holy things which the Lord of Israel dedicate to the Lord, while he has uncleanness upon him, that person shall be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord. Whatever man of the descendants of Aaron, who is a leper, okay, someone who had leprosy, a disease, or has a discharge, some sort of fluid coming out of their body, shall not eat the holy offerings until he is clean. And whoever touches anything made unclean by a corpse, or a man who has had an emission of semen, look what we talk about here in these studies, or whoever touches any creeping thing by which he would be made unclean, or any person by whom he would become unclean, whatever his uncleanness may be, the person who has touched any such thing shall be unclean until evening, and shall not eat the holy offerings unless he washes his body with water. So this had to do with Aaron and his sons eating the holy things. Again, as I just mentioned at the end of chapter 21, they were allowed to take a portion of the sacrifices, the offerings that people would bring, and they could consume those. That was part of how they sustained themselves. But if they had any of these issues, then they had to keep themselves from eating those holy things. And we're told here that he would be made unclean. But notice in verse 6, he will be unclean until evening. He shall not eat the holy offerings unless he washes his body with water. There it is. There was a way for him to cleanse himself. Verse 7, and when the sun goes down, he shall be clean. And afterward he may eat the holy offerings because it is his food. Whatever dies naturally or is torn by beasts, he shall not eat, to defile himself with it. I am the Lord. That's what God says. They shall therefore keep my ordinance, lest they bear sin. So they couldn't eat an animal that had been killed by another animal. Sorry. Verse 9. They shall therefore keep my ordinance, lest they bear sin for it and die thereby, if they profane it. I, the Lord, sanctified them. So this was upon penalty of death. They were not to do these things. Verse 10. No outsider shall eat the holy offering. One who dwells with the priest or a hired servant shall not eat the holy thing. But if the priest, check this out, buys a person with money, if they buy a servant, he may eat it. And one who is born in his house may eat his food. Now, just a quick note. You did hear that right. If the priest bought somebody, because that was very common, they would buy servants. But you will note that to buy a servant was not necessarily what's it called? It was allowed, but it's just a quick little note here. They could actually eat the holy things, so that indicates to us that that servant that's been bought would need to be treated appropriately, accordingly. Hey, I bought you. You're part of my family. You can eat these holy things, which is fascinating. Fascinating. Verse 12, if the priest's daughter is married to an outsider, she may not eat the holy offerings. But if the priest's daughter is a widow or divorced and has no child and has returned to her father's house as in her youth, she may eat her father's food, but no outsider shall eat it. And if a man eats the holy offering unintentionally, then he shall restore a holy offering to the priest and add 1/5 to it. They shall not profane the holy offerings of the children of it. 1/5 would be like a penalty. You gotta restore it and pay this. You know, in other words, pay attention. You ate it unintentionally. Don't do that again. Verse 15, they shall not profane the holy offerings of the children of Israel, which they offer to the Lord, or allow them to bear the guilt of trespass when they eat their holy offerings, for I, the Lord, sanctify them. I forgot to mention, man, I'm just messing things up here. Okay, for those that take notes, Leviticus 22. This was a hard one again. You can see that there are various, there's one main topic, but various, several different, various topics inside there. So I didn't have any subpoints. But verses 1 down to verse 16, I titled Eating the Holy Things. Okay, Eating the Holy Things, verses 1 down to verse 16. Then beginning at verse 17 and going down to verse 30, I titled Offering Guidelines. Offering Guidelines. Verse 17. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, and to all the children of Israel, and say to them, Whatever man of the house of Israel, or of the strangers in Israel, who offers his sacrifice for any of his vows, or any of his freewill offerings, which they offer to the Lord as a burnt offering. So there's our context. If he's offering for a vow or a freewill offering, they're going to offer it as a burnt offering. It's going to be burned. Verse 19, you shall offer of your own free will a male without blemish from the cattle, not a person, not your little brother, from the cattle, from the sheep, or from the goats, a male. Whatever has a defect, you shall not offer, for it shall not be acceptable on your behalf. Verse 21, and whoever offers a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord to fulfill his vow, or a free will offering from the cattle or the sheep, it must be perfect to be accepted. There shall be no defect in it. Why? Because the sacrifices were a picture of the perfect Lamb of God, Jesus the Christ, who would be sacrificed for us, the perfect Lamb. Right? That's why these could not be. They could not have blemish. Verse 22. Those that are blind or broken or maimed, or have an ulcer or eczema or scabs, you shall not offer to the Lord, nor make an offering by fire of them on the altar to the Lord. Either a bull or a lamb that has any limb too long or too short, you may offer as a free will offering, but for a vow it shall not be accepted. Verse 24, you shall not offer to the Lord what is bruised or crushed or torn or cut, nor shall you make any offering of them in your land. Nor from a foreigner's hand shall you offer any of these as the bread of your God, because their corruption is in them and defects are in them. They shall not be accepted on your behalf. Now you get some little clues there. You cannot offer, verse 24, do not offer those in your land. Verse 25, if a foreigner gives you these things, these animals that are damaged. So note, why were they not allowed to offer imperfect animals? Well, I told you already about the example they were of Jesus, a perfect animal, a perfect lamb. But also, again, the pagan peoples around them, the idolaters, had no problem offering subpar things to their gods. We always want to give the best. So God sets that example here in Leviticus 21-22, that we need to always be thinking about the best that we're giving to God. It is fascinating that for us, and I'll use myself as an example as I often do, when I surrendered my life to the Lord at the age of 20, I was a mess, just a broken mess. And I came to God essentially with my pile of mess and said, God, it's all I got. Please have mercy on me. Please take this. And he accepted that. It was all that I had. It was all that I could give. I had nothing else. And God, in his goodness and in his mercy, took that from me and then began to change me, make me new. Now that I'm born again, I don't want to bring my all of my defects to him. My defective merchandise to him. Now, there is a sense in which, man, it's always going to be defective because I'm defective. But the idea is that I always want to bring my very best to the Lord. I don't want to give if I'm speaking to students right now. You don't have money to give. What do you have to give? Your strength, your health, your time. There's lots that you have to give, actually. I want to give a wholehearted attempt at everything that I do because I'm doing it as unto the Lord. See how that works? I don't want to give them a half-hearted, half-baked, as my dad used to say, a half-baked offering. I'm going to give him my very best. So keep that in mind. Give him your very best. Let's give him our very best. Let's push on here. Verse 26, and the Lord God spoke to Moses, saying, when a bull or sheep or a goat is born, it shall be 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day and thereafter it shall be accepted as an offering made by fire to the Lord. Whether it is a cow or a ewe, Do not kill both her and her young on the same day. And when you offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, offer it of your own free will. On the same day it shall be eaten. You shall not leave. You shall leave none of it until morning. I am the Lord. And then finally, in verses 31 through 33, God calls for obedience. Therefore, you shall keep my commandments and perform them. I am the Lord. You shall not profane my holy name, but I will be I'll be be made holy among the children of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. That's our goal. We want to hallow God. We want to represent Him as being holy. So we need to then live holy lives. Verse 33, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, I am the Lord. So we need to remember that God saved us. He's the Lord. We need to do our best to represent Him in holiness because He is holy. We thus need to be holy. Now let me finish with this in John chapter 4. You can turn there if you want. John chapter 4, verses 19 through 24 is a wonderful story of Jesus talking to a woman. And he says in the middle of this conversation, or rather the woman said to him, Sir, I perceive you are a prophet. She says, Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where we ought to worship, where one ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. In other words, he was saying, you're going to worship everywhere. It's not going to be one specific place. Plus, the temple in Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. So worship was going to go from the temple to everywhere. But he goes on to say, you worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. Why do I finish with that? Because Jesus was making it clear that if we're going to worship God, that we need to worship Him the way that He prescribes. We do not worship Him in just any old way, in the way that we want or the way that we decide. That's what the pagans did. That's what the idolaters did. Thus, they shaved their heads in weird places. They shaved their beards. They cut themselves. They offered defective sacrifices. We don't do any of those things. We come to God, as we read there in John chapter 4, Jesus said it Himself, we worship God in spirit and in truth. We don't do it with animal sacrifices anymore. We worship in spirit and in truth. Did you see that? Not with animal sacrifices, that's past. Jesus was the last of the animal sacrifices. He sacrificed Himself as the lamb. So we now worship in spirit and in truth. We need to make sure that we are worshiping the way that God prescribes. Not by putting on a show, not by coming up with different ideas about how we want to worship God, but what does God require? What does God say in His Word? So we always want to go back to His Word and go, okay, this is what God says. This is the way that we need to do it. God was very specific with His people in Leviticus 21 and 22 when it came with the priests specifically, because that's who it started with, when it came to worship, to offerings. Because He was setting the pattern, it needed to be done according to the way that He prescribed and not the way that they saw all of the pagans and idolaters around them doing it, not the way they felt like doing it, but the way that God required. Let's you and I keep that in mind and worship God in spirit and in truth. Thank you so much for sticking with this, and I look forward to the remainder of the studies here in Leviticus, and we'll get all of these gaps filled in. If you're on one of the podcasts, God bless you so much for listening, and we hope that you are blessed. Please make sure you let us know if you are. It's encouraging to us. God bless you all, and look forward to talking with you again very soon.